David, welcome to 92nd Street Y. This is your first time on stage here, is it?
I did the Q one time. It was my first A.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I want to see. The A is more fun than the Q, I think.
I think so, yeah.
I thought we would start by talking about how we know each other.
Yeah, I think I wanted to do that like at the end to make sure we did that. So, can I say how we know each other?
Yes, we'll each give our version of events because I suspect it might be different, but you go first.
Okay, my version is that in our relationship, our first date was, I guess, me criticizing some of your work in my first book.
Yes.
And I remember when, not expecting that book to do much, I was at like a very small event in Greenwich Village, and somebody came by and said, I just saw reading your book at a cafe, Malcolm Gladwell, and I was like, oh, darn, because I didn't think it would get on your radar.
Yeah.
And then our second date was you critiquing me back in the New Yorker, also being very positive, but also critiquing me back in the New Yorker.
Hold on. I wrote an article for the magazine, which was, it was the warmest, sweetest embrace of your book.
Yes.
And then I did a separate piece for the website where I gently pushed back against some of your more outrageous assertions.
Okay.
And then, I'm going to pick up the story from here.
Okay.
Then, was I on book
so
tour?
Gentle.
You were on book tour. I wasn't on book. Why was I was in Washington, D.C., and I'm going into NPR, and then you come swinging through the door.
Me?
You did. Did you not remember this? It was in the movies they would call us meeting cute. And then for some reason we started running together.
Yeah. Well, no, you skipped over our third date.
Yeah.
Which was the first time we actually met in person, which was at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference.
Oh, that's right.
That was the first time we met in person. We were invited to do a debate that was 10,000 hours versus the sports gene.
Yeah.
And in some ways, my preparation for that debate, because you're very clever and I'd never met you and I didn't want to get embarrassed.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of homework, and that debate in some ways seeded some of the ideas for this book. But what I really want to say about that debate was, you could very much have just like tried to, crush me or like use your literary clout or whatever it was, but instead we ended up having a great conversation. Not only that, but when we came off the stage, you told me what you thought my good points were and said, when we're back in New York tomorrow, why don't you go running? He said, this was a great idea, you should explore that more. And for me, this was in many ways like the people I write about in chapter 10 of Range, where this could have become a zero-sum thing, which frankly with some other authors that I came into conflict with, it did become a zero-sum thing. But in this case, it wasn't. Like the foxes in chapter 10, you were willing to update your mental models, and I learned from that. And I think in some ways it empowered me to take on a more amorphous and ambitious book in this project that I know is imperfect, but that I was willing to do because of that. And that sort of openness and exchange, I think, made me better. And I think if that happened more, we can see in society, I think there are too many conflicts that are viewed as zero-sum ideas. We were both disincentivized from agreeing about anything in many ways, but it made me better. And for me, it's kind of a model of an intellectual relationship, so I really appreciate that.
I feel slightly guilty because I have I developed this whole theory of love bombing, which was when someone criticizes you, the only appropriate response is to love them back, even if you're doing it cynically, because it completely disarms them. It's the last thing they're expecting. But in your case, I started out thinking, I'll just love bomb him, and then I realized, actually, he has convinced me. So it started cynical and ended up totally idealistic in the sense that I was like, oh, he's totally right. I tried to love bomb him and failed because he actually won me over.
And by the way, not to critique one of your theories, but I've seen your responses to like some of Chris Chabris's criticism, and I wouldn't call that love bombing. That's what I was worried I was going to get.
I occasionally stray.
Guillotining.
We all stray off the straight and narrow, but I do, in the main, I like to love my critics. But wait, we have to get to the point. What was it? So we had this discussion. It wasn't a debate. It was a discussion at the MIT Sloan's conference, and you said it sowed the seeds for this book. What was the seed?
So in trying to anticipate what I thought you would have to argue in this debate, I said, well, you'll have to argue in favor of early specialization in sports. And so I went and looked at all the research I could find about the development of athletes, and it showed that this pattern that athletes who go on to become elite have a sampling period where they play a broad range of sports. They gain these broad general skills that become a scaffolding for later skills. They learn about their interests, they learn about their abilities. They delay specializing until later than their peers who plateau at lower levels. And it's not even just a selection effect, because when you match kids in studies where they're matched for a certain ability level at a certain age and tracked, the ones who in a certain age do more variety of different sports improve more by time too, basically. And so I sort of brought that up. And in some ways that was incompatible with some aspects of the 10,000 hour theory. And so when we were walking up the stage, and we framed it as the Roger versus Tiger problem, right?
Wait, so pause on that point.
Okay.
Build out Roger versus Tiger, because that's a beautifully simple way of illustrating this argument.
Okay, so Tiger Woods, probably even for people who don't know his story, you've probably absorbed at least the gist of it, which is 7 months old, his father gives him a putter, not trying to train him to be a golfer, but just gives him a putter. He starts carrying it around in his baby walker. At 10 months, he starts imitating a swing. He was physically precocious. 2 years old, he's on national television. 2 years old, the CDC development benchmarks are stands on tiptoes and kicks a ball, and he went on television and showed his driving off in front of Bob Hope, basically. By 3, his father was media training him. At 4, he started hustling people, basically. He's famous as a teenager. By 21, he's the greatest golfer in the world. Roger Federer, maybe the most famous development story in the history of anything. Mm-hmm. Roger Federer, meanwhile, played about a dozen different skiing, skateboarding, badminton, tennis, basketball, soccer, all these things. Mother was a tennis coach, refused to coach him because he wouldn't return balls normally. She said it was no fun. When his coaches tried to bump him up a level, he declined because he just wanted to talk about pro wrestling with his friends after practice. When he finally got good enough to warrant an interview with a local newspaper, and the reporter asked him if he ever became a pro, what he would buy with his first paycheck, he said a Mercedes, and his mother was appalled and asked if she could hear the interview recording, and he had actually said "mehr CDs" in a Swiss German accent. He just wanted more CDs. And so then she was like, okay, we're doing okay. His father had no rules, just said don't cheat, don't care anything else. And he specialized, he continued playing badminton, basketball, soccer, specialized years after.
At what age is Roger Federer really only playing tennis?
Mid-teen years, basically, where he's only doing tennis. But he still continues to non-formally play soccer, even when he's doing that. Yeah. And other informal sports, continues with them even after that. And the question basically was, which one of these models is the norm? Which one should we extrapolate from?
Why? This, to me, is the fascinating question. So we have these two of the greatest athletes of the last 50 years represent diametrically opposed models of development.
One well-known, one unknown development story.
We're in love with the Tiger model. Yeah. If I polled the audience, most of them would say the Tiger implicitly is the model that leads to greatness. Mm-hmm. You're arguing, no, it's the Roger model. Why? It doesn't. One thing I've never understood is why did we fall in love with the Tiger model and not like the Roger model?
Wait, I thought you made us fall in love with the Tiger model.
Don't blame me. I did not write a book about sports.
I'm just kidding.
Everyone says I wrote a book about sports.
I know. No, that's true. That is very true. That ideas that you started became outrageous in other hands in many cases.
That's a nice way to put it.
I remember the Time magazine article that was like unrecognizable about theories.
Well, it was that point I was positing that there was another Malcolm Gladwell walking around with curly hair who had a set of views that were sort of unknown to me.
But in terms of Tiger, I think it's dramatic. It's incredibly dramatic. There's video of him on YouTube at age 2. It makes a ton of intuitive sense. It's very easy for a prescription to tell people. And I think, as you said, we're obsessed with precocity, right? You said these child prodigy videos are human cat videos. And I think that's true, and I'm mad I didn't think of that line for my book.
But is that enough, though? Because it's also clear that Tiger pays an extraordinary price for his precocity in a way that Federer does not, right? In fact, it's not difficult to reach the conclusion that one of the reasons Tiger had a kind of meltdown for many years is that he really has been a prisoner of golf since he was this high. And one of the reasons Federer seems so well adjusted is that he had a normal childhood.
He did. He completely had a normal childhood. The writer who probably knows the family best called his parents pulley. not pushy. So he did have a very normal childhood.
Yeah. So even given the fact that the tiger model is costly, we still embrace it.
Yes, because, well, we're obsessed with excellence. And I think, so one of the themes in Range, I think, is that there are, and maybe this doesn't apply to golf, and we can talk about that, but that there are things that you can do that cause head starts that actually systematically undermine long-term development. But I think that is a deeply counterintuitive idea. And when push comes to shove, our intuition is that getting ahead is getting ahead, and that prodigious performance in a child is a trajectory, not just a cross-section, but that's often not the case. But it's also, it's admirable to see someone want to work that hard. Like, I respect that in them. And it's intuitive that would work. But also that's, one of the reasons we do science is because our intuition can't always figure it out.
So let's walk through the reasons why the tiger model doesn't work. And as far as I can tell from reading your book, there's at least 3, if not more. But starting with walk us through the match argument, which is a really interesting one, which had never occurred to me.
So match quality is this term that economists use to basically describe the degree of fit between an individual's abilities, their interests, and the work that they do. It turns out to be incredibly important for motivation, for their performance, right, and even their apparent grit. So you get good fit, and it'll look like grit when someone does something, when they're in something that fits correctly. And the problem is in sports selection, this dovetails with something you've written about, the earlier it goes, the less likely you optimize someone's match quality. So one of the things that happens when you delay matching is you give people a chance to get more signal about what they're good at, and they end up picking better matches for themselves, and not just in sports. So one of the other studies in Range looks at timing of specialization in higher education, and the question the economist asks is, who wins the trade-off, the early specializers or the late specializers? And what he finds is the early specializers do in fact jump out to an income lead after college, but by year 6, the later specializers who have picked a better match, have a faster growth rate, fly past them, and the early specializers start quitting in much higher numbers because, it's like if we treated those decisions the way we treated dating, we would never pressure people to settle down that quickly before they took some more data about things. And So
to pause on this, because I think this is a crucial point, the parent who observes of their 6-year-old that, Lucy is really well coordinated and flexible. I want to make her a gymnast.
Yeah.
The mistake they're making is that you don't know at 6 whether Lucy is best cut out for gymnastics. And if you wait until 12, gymnastics may be a bad example here, but if you wait longer, you have a better likelihood of figuring out what her skills match up with.
Definitely.
6 is just too soon.
Yes, gymnastics women's gymnastics specifically is a weird example because it requires a pre-puberty peak.
Yeah, actually, what's a better example?
But because, female gymnasts have shrunk from 5'3" to 4'9" on average in the last 30 years because it makes their power to weight ratio better and lower moment of inertia, so that's a whole different advantage. But you're absolutely right. So, and Tiger Woods, by the way, he said in 2000 his father never asked him to play golf. It was him asking his father to play. It was the child's interest that matters. And so I think the idea that he was like father manufactured from the get-go, like you shouldn't be worried about missing the next Tiger Woods, because if there's that like incredible sort of outlier display of interest, like that's not something that his father manufactured from the get-go.
Yeah.
So I think people are worried about missing that, but really what you should be oriented toward is match quality. And there's all sorts of reasons. So you've written about the relative age effect, right? Mm-hmm. So I was just looking at a breakdown of the birthdays of soccer players in the U17, under 17 European Championships. 47% of them were born in January, February, and March, and 6% in the last 3 months of the year. And that's because as we push selection earlier and earlier, all the coaches are selecting for is the kids that are effectively a year older, and they are actually biologically mature, and they're mistaking that for talent, and then they're in the pipeline. You've deselected the other kids. And it's getting more and more exacerbated, where we're picking for things that have nothing to do with the traits you ultimately want, because we're driving selection earlier and earlier.
Yeah. So that's one argument that I can see actually it's kind of fascinating to apply that outside of sports as well. So the equivalent would be to observe of your 6-year-old that she has a facility for counting, and to put her immediately into a pre-math PhD program. But that's exactly what parents are doing.
And in fact,
right?
what they're and counting is a good example because that what these things that parents do are usually based on is the observation of what's called a closed skill, something like counting, or the kid walks early or something like that. And those kinds of closed skills that aren't these more general pieces of scaffolding that are good for long-term development, there's a fade-out effect on those kinds of skills, whether they're in sports, whether they're in math, lots of academic programs that are meant to give kids a boost early on to get them on a different trajectory, and it does initially, because the way you can give them the fastest improvement is by teaching them closed skills that have to do with procedures that are used over and over and over. And there's a ubiquitous fade-out effect, which is actually just other people catching up, because everyone's going to learn that skill eventually, and it ceases to become an advantage. And so we make choices based on precocity in these closed skills in many cases that are not really in the long-term an advantage.
Yeah. So second argument is that in order to excel at a complex skill in the long term, you need to build a broad base.
Yeah.
So walk us through that. Both, I'm interested in this one. This one's even more relevant outside the sports realm.
Yeah. Yeah.
But give us both sports and non-sports in this instance.
Yeah, so I wonder if this is, maybe we should introduce the issue of the kind and wicked learning environment, basically, which are terms taken from a psychologist named Robin Hogarth. And one of the reasons, there's a real lack of study in golf, which is interesting, but one of the reasons I can believe that early specialization may in fact work in golf, although the best player in the world right now, Brooks Koepka, picked up golf later because he got in a car accident and his parents didn't want him to do contact sports anymore. But is a kind learning environment is where all the information is available, next steps are totally clear, people often wait for each other to take turns, patterns repeat, feedback is automatic and totally accurate after everything you do. So golf is almost like an industrial task. You try to do known movements over and over and over with as little deviation as possible. That's a kind learning environment.
So give me other examples of kind learning.
Chess is a kind learning environment.
Yeah.
So it's based, the grandmaster's advantage in chess is basically pattern recognition. And that also is the reason why it is so amenable to automation, because computers are even better at pattern recognition. So the kinder an environment is, golf is like entertainment, and we still watch people playing chess because it's entertainment, but the more of a kind environment the skill is, the more easy it is to automate, which is why, now your iPhone app can beat Gary Kasparov. On the wicked end are challenges where the rules may not be clear. People are acting in real time. They're more dynamic. You may or may not get feedback after everything you do. Next steps aren't always clear. The feedback may be delayed or may be inaccurate. So Hogarth used this example I love of a famous New York City physician who became renowned because weeks before patients would develop typhoid, by palpating their tongue, feeling around their tongue with his hands, he could predict that they would get typhoid right again and again and again. And as one of his colleagues eventually observed, he was a more productive carrier of typhoid than Typhoid Mary using just his hands. And so
yeah,
that's a really wicked learning environment because the feedback,
yeah.
Wait, that wasn't even another joke. The feedback teaches exactly the wrong lesson. And so he gets famous for this feedback loop that teaches him the wrong lesson. Most environments aren't that wicked either. But the closer you are to the wicked end of the spectrum, the more you have to do what's called transfer, where you take knowledge and skills and have to apply them to situations you have never seen before. So this more repetitive using procedures knowledge then can become an impediment because you're stuck doing the same things when you really have to transfer to situations you haven't seen before.
Starting a business would be wicked.
Starting a business would be wicked, and I think that's one reason why, there was some recent research from LinkedIn that showed people who become successful executives, one of the best predictors is the number of job functions they've worked across within an industry. Or again, to go to this obsession with precocity, when Mark Zuckerberg was 22 and he said young people are just smarter, and MIT Northwestern and the Census Bureau just has research out showing that the average age of a founder of a blockbuster startup on the day of founding, not even when it becomes a blockbuster, is about 46.
Yeah.
But like the Tiger story, we just focus on the Zuckerberg story, but actually people have to zigzag usually quite a bit before they find that ground, because the goal isn't initially clear like it is in kind learning environments.
Yeah, yeah. So it's odd that the kind of myth of precocity and the idea that the Tiger model is so important is relevant only in the areas that we're least interested in.
That's right? I should have talked to you before I wrote some of the lines in the book. Yeah. No, that's a very clever way to phrase it. And that's so one of the things that I was critiquing in Range was, books that we've both read sort of in the performance genre have used the Tiger model, is the most popular model from which to extrapolate to everything else in the world. Like literally, I think talent is overrated. The back cover says Tiger Woods, the Polgars, the chess family, and this is what works for anything that you care about. And in fact, it's that leap that is a problem. It may work in golf, but it's the extrapolation where we've made a mistake.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about this this notion of in sports. So what's a good example of a wicked sport?
I don't think any sports are that wicked. I think because they're all rule bound. So what Hogarth said is tennis is more wicked than golf.
Yeah.
Because tennis is dynamic. You have to use so-called anticipatory skills where the sport is actually happening too fast for you to react to. So you need to learn to pick up cues in a player's body and spin of the ball and things like that to act faster than you could otherwise. So it's much more dynamic. But it's still, and soccer, really one of the reasons why applying like Moneyball stuff to soccer has been so difficult because it's so fluid and the game changes so much that analytics hasn't made nearly as big an impact there as like baseball where something happens and it stops and something happens and it stops. And so analytics have made a much better impact. But Hogarth then says, what we're really mostly playing in the world, the things we most care about are Martian tennis, where you can see people doing something, but nobody's told you the rules. It's up to you to deduce them, and by the way, they can change at any time. And that's these other challenges that we mostly care about.
What about, I was thinking that there's a third reason why you would want to take a generalist course as opposed to a specialization course, and that is that it is only through taking a generalist approach that you can have novel skills. Not only, but the chief reason you'd want to like. So I'm thinking of this in basketball that, every now and again there's someone like Akeem Olajuwon or Steve Nash, these brilliant basketball players who have strong grounding in soccer.
Yeah.
And that's very rare among basketball players. But we say of those who come to basketball late from soccer that they have certain skills that are unusual.
Yeah.
Or at least they have developed certain skills much more than their peers.
That's right.
That come from soccer, and that is what gives them their special advantage, their comparative advantage. So it's quite conceivable that had he not played soccer, Steve Nash would not have been a superb NBA player, because what sets him apart as an NBA player is the fact he brings an unusual skill set.
It just so happens that I was emailing with Steve Nash about this last week. Canadian royalty.
Are you serious?
Yes.
That's hilarious.
And there was this HBO Real Sport segment about sport development in Norway because Norway blew everybody away in these last Winter Olympics, and it's all this unstructured stuff. They're not even allowed to have formal games until competitions until their sort of mid or later teen years. And Steve's a big soccer fan, and France, which just won the World Cup, overhauled its development pipeline starting decades ago to incorporate this. So a French young soccer player plays about half as many formal games as an American soccer player of the same age. And they have this saying, there's no remote control, meaning the coaches aren't even allowed to talk to them most of the time. They want to do this free form, unstructured stuff. So I actually think that, so Steve Nash didn't even get a basketball until he was 13, by the way. And I like him as an example because he's relatively normal sized, he's not that big.
So let's pause. For those of you who don't know Steve, it occurs to me, I'm so deep inside basketballness that I forget that other people are not.
Right.
Steve Nash is someone who sort of physically resembles me.
Yeah.
He and happens to be one of the 10 greatest point guards of the last 50 years.
Two-time NBA MVP for sure. Oh yeah. Oh, maybe one of the best.
I mean, he's
three.
A legendary basketball player, and he's a skinny guy from Canada. I mean, you could just the number of parallels between him and me are astonishing.
Right. This Venn diagram is you and Steve Nash alone.
That's right. And he, also charming and well. But so go back to you were emailing with Steve.
Oh yeah, and so we watched this Real Sports, and he's actually exploring starting an academy to incorporate these principles of unstructured play, because I think in some ways multi-sport is actually just a proxy for movement diversity, really. Mm-hmm. Because if you go around to Brazil, the kids aren't even playing soccer, they're playing futsal, this game that's small ball stays on the ground, they'll play on a shape this size one day, sand one day, cobblestones the other day. So they're playing futsal, but it's really a different game all the time. It's involving different anticipatory skills. And so he's into this, and so he wants to start an academy because he realizes that his imprimatur, Steve Nash's name, will allow parents to say, okay, maybe we will do like what the science says we should do instead of going to early specialization. And Judy Murray, Andy and Jamie Murray's mother, has done the same thing in the UK, where she basically facilitates unstructured development and people send their kids to her camp. They won't let the kids do this stuff on their own, but if Judy Murray says it's okay, like then it's okay.
Yeah, it gives them permission.
Yeah.
But this raises another thing that's wrong with early specialization, which again sounds like it's specific to sports, but applies, and I want to talk about this notion, and you pointed out that when you specialize early and you're doing the same repetitive movements over and over again, your risk of injury later in life starts to increase.
Oh, yeah.
So, but there's a beautiful parallel to this in non-sporting things,
Yeah.
which is this notion of burnout.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that's not a really crucial, that somehow there is something about early specialization that leaches the joy out of an intellectual activity and limits it far too early.
I think that's probably true for a lot of people. But by the way, I want to say one interesting thing about the injury issue, which is Cirque du Soleil, lots of Olympians, they, looking at this kind of, they have a ton of physiology data, decided to have their performers learn the basics of other performers' skills, not because they were going to perform them, but to see if it would make them more creative. And subjectively, they thought it did. But they measure their injury rates next to Canadian gymnastics and drop their injury rates by 1/3. Mm-hmm. So something about doing that makes people less fragile. And I have theories about what that is, but it doesn't matter. The fact is it works. But I think you're absolutely right. So like when I started, I had to write about music and range, of course, because it's probably the next domain that's most associated with early specialization. And when you look at those studies, the main reason that people, very promising musicians, quit is they report a mismatch between the instrument they play and the instrument they wanted to play. And if you look at the pattern of their development, they will usually, so the ones who go on to become the best typically have a sampling period, just like the athletes. So like even Yo-Yo Ma, who actually did focus very early, had a sampling period. He just went through it a heck of a lot quicker than most people do, because he didn't like the first two instruments that he was playing. And this, what the ones who go on to become exceptional, they early on spread their early practice across a larger number of instruments, whereas what it looks like for the ones who plateau at lower levels and or quit, they have this first instrument where they get tons of practice and someone kind of tells them, you can't switch now, you have a head start, you'll get behind. So it's, sunk cost fallacy kind of thing, and they end up quitting. So like in Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, on the first page, she says, here are the secrets to successful children, and assigns one of her children violin and presides over 5 hours a day of practice. And to the author's credit, later in the book, she acknowledges the daughter says, you picked it, not me, and quits, right? People, that part of the message didn't get as famous, but it is in the book.
5 hours of violin a day is just the most bananas idea I've ever heard. Not just for the child who has to play 5 hours, but for the parent who has to listen to 5 hours.
No,
Why would anyone do that to themselves?
My
parents tried to make
idea.
me play the violin, by the way.
What? That didn't.
1 week. It lasted my sampling period was 1 week.
So that's great.
And I walked away. Why did I quit violin after 1 week? Because my brother, who's older and musical, I say that in scare quotes, I had to, as a child, listen to him endlessly bang away on the piano. And I was like, it clearly is going to take many, many years for him to even be remotely kind of pleasing on this instrument. Why would I put everyone else in our family through the same painful process?
That's so magnanimous of you to
I know,
not
I
become a
retreated to
musician.
my room and closed the door. Anyway, this is not about my family pathologies. This is about something much more important. But I want to talk about this in terms of, let's talk about this in terms of schooling. So if I make David Epstein czar of American schooling, let's leave sports aside for a while.
Yeah.
I would like you to redesign the curriculum of K through 12 to maximize people's development as human beings. Actually, not even K through 12, K through the end of college. Tell me what you would do in light of what you've learned from range.
Geez, what a question. The first thing I would do is before I would just overhaul the system from the bottom, I would start with things that we actually could do at no cost today, which is, so chapter 4 is called Learning Fast and Slow, with apologies to Daniel Kahneman. And it details these really well-known findings in cognitive psychology about learning that, again, are deeply counterintuitive because they show that the quickest way to demonstrate progress actually undermines long-term progress. So probably the single most surprising study in the book to me was this one done at the Air Force Academy.
I love this one.
It's amazing. So, because you could never do this any other place, right? So you have an Air Force Academy that brings in, 1,000 students every year. They all have to take a sequence of 3 math courses, Calculus 1, Calculus 2, and they are randomized to professors for Calculus 1, re-randomized for Calculus 2, re-randomized again. And so you have this incredible experimental condition. And these researchers who wanted to see the impact of teaching in this incredible natural experiment. And so they followed thousands of students and 100 different professors, and what they found was that the students, so the students' characteristics coming in were evenly spread across classes. The students who overperformed compared to the ability they came in with, the most in Calculus 1, then systematically underperformed in all of the follow-on courses. The professor whose students did 6th best in Calculus 1 out of 100 and got the 7th best ratings from the students finished dead last in how his students' performance was in their follow-on math courses after that. There was almost an inverse relationship between how well students overperformed in Calculus 1 and how much they then underperformed in the follow-on courses, and between how well they rated that first professor. And it turned out what those professors were doing was they were teaching using procedures knowledge. They were teaching a narrow curriculum that worked really well for the Calculus 1 test, but did not set up these broad frameworks that allow you to scaffold later knowledge. And so, again, that's so deeply counterintuitive that you could do something that causes this kind of short-term progress. Everyone had to take the same test, of course, and somehow undermines long-term development. And so I think, you can kind of see where I'm getting at, this fact that the way we use testing as evaluation can be a real problem if you're incentivizing people to impart using procedures knowledge that can make kids do the best on the test, but is not the best for their long-term development. Yeah. So that's a problem. Testing is wonderful, but for learning. So there are 3, in that chapter, sort of 3 strategies: testing, interleaving, and spacing. Testing is just quiz yourself, right? You want to force someone to generate an answer before they know what they're doing, because it's the attempt to generate an answer that then primes your brain to remember something when you're told the answer. So you want to test before people are ready. Interleaving means doing tons of different kinds of problems. The way that math study usually works in the US is you do a type of problem, do it, problem A, B, C, and that leads to using procedures knowledge. What you want to do is never show the same exact problem twice, and what that forces the learner to do is to match a strategy to a problem instead of learn how to execute a procedure. That's called interleaving, where you mix up these problems. Third, spacing. You don't want to do, we usually do, you do one thing, you wait, and then you just move on to something else, whether this is school or professional development. What you really want to do is do something, do some other things, and then come back to that thing. And so you have this, you're repeatedly coming back to things. So a famous spacing study, Spanish vocabulary learners, they were taught, one group was taught 8 hours on one day, the other group 4 hours on day 1, 4 hours a month later, all same total training. 8 years later, when they were brought back, Group 2 remembered 250% more with no study in the interim, right? Same amount of study. So the first thing I would do is incorporate testing, spacing, testing for evaluation, testing not for evaluation, testing for learning before people are ready, spacing and interleaving in everything we do, because that's no-cost stuff that scaffolds learning in a totally different way, where you learn this knowledge. It's called making connections knowledge instead of procedure.
Underneath all that is this really fundamental insight, which is that sometimes the very best teachers are those who disadvantage us in the short term.
Yeah, yes. And I mean, that's one of the themes of the book, is that the things that you can do that look the best in the short term, in order to be, in your terms, in order to be the best at X, it seems intuitive that you should just start doing X as soon as possible, but that turns out not to be the right thing. More in a more conceptual level, if I were the school czar, I think there's something I talk about there's a section in the book where I talk about the Army and their failure to retain their most talented officers. And first they tried to throw money at them, and that the people who were going to stayed anyway, and the people who were going to leave left anyway, and that was $500 million of taxpayer money. And then they started something called talent-based branching, where instead of saying, here's your career track, up or out, someone goes in and say, here's a bunch of career tracks. You can sample a couple. We'll pair you with a coach. And after each one, they'll help you reflect on what you learned about your own abilities, what you learned about your own interests, and you'll keep triangulating until you get this better match. And I think I would take that conceptual approach to kind of everything, where you help people. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from Herminia Ibarra, who studies how people find careers that fit them. She says, we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. And what she means is, there's this whole industry that tells you can just introspect and decide who you are. But in fact, the only way we learn about ourselves and our options is by doing stuff and reflecting on it. So I think I would want to build that kind of talent-based branching where the teacher or coach is someone who helps a person reflect on what they've learned about their own abilities and interests from these multiple experiences.
You know what the enemy of what you're describing is self-knowledge. I've always thought that self-knowledge was overrated. Why is it so important to know the kind of person you are? And what you're describing is the benefits of not knowing. So people who say, I'm not a math person, I'm very X or Y, are precisely the people who would object, or who would have a problem with the kind of course of action you're describing.
Right.
You're asking people to sample widely outside their areas of specialty, or their areas of interest, or their areas of, not interest, their areas of imagined interest and imagined specialty, right? On the grounds that they don't know what it is that they'll either thrive at or what they need to be good.
Their insight into themselves is constrained by their roster of previous experiences, period.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to know. And not only that, but this concept I write about, the end of history illusion, right? Which shows that at every time point in life, we realize we've changed a lot in the past. Our preferences, our values, what we think our strengths and weaknesses are, the friends we prefer, the things we like to do for fun. And at every time point, we then underestimate how much we will change in the future. We keep saying like, man, I changed a lot from these experiences there, but now I'm pretty much done. And we say that at every time point. So it leads to these really weird results. Like when people are asked how much they would pay to see their favorite band today, 10 years from now, the average answer is $129. And when they're asked how much they would pay, wait, that wasn't even a joke. When they're asked how much they would pay today to see their favorite band from 10 years ago, the average answer is $80. And so we really underestimate how much we change. So this idea that we come like fully formed with insight into ourselves is not supported by any of the work in this.
You know what this reminds me of? In this season of my podcast, I have all these episodes about Jesuits. The theme is how to think like a Jesuit, because I love the way Jesuits think. And the Jesuits had this really lovely notion, and by the way, if there's a Jesuit in the audience and I get this wrong, just raise your hand and correct me. I'm not a Jesuit, that's why I'm like, but they have a notion of what's called disordered attachments. And the idea, this is an idea from St. Ignatius, is that you cannot approach a problem if you're bringing with you attachments that get in the way of listening clearly, seeing the nature of the. So the guy I was talking to gave me this example of when he was a novice, and you're supposed to be sent out to do your training, and he said to his senior, he said, I'll do anything you want. I'll go anywhere to do my training. Just don't send me to a hospital because I just can't stand the sight of blood. And the guy said, you're going to a hospital. And it's exactly your point, though. He was observing that he had a disordered attachment to the idea that he was someone who could not deal with that particular set of problems. And that set of problems were not useful to the direction he wanted to go on. And the senior priest understood that, no, you're 25 years old. You can't have a self-definition that rules out this massive area of your presumed responsibility, which is people who are suffering, right? Who are physically suffering.
I mean, especially at 25, right? The period of fastest personality change over your life is 18 to 28. So making those decisions for a 25-year-old is making a decision for someone that you don't really know yet, and for a world that you can't really conceive. Right? Yeah. And I don't think that's a good strategy for matching.
Let's go radical for a moment. What if, for example, would you go for the following idea? What if we had students choose when at the point in high school when you start choosing your own courses, what if we took that away and we just assign people courses randomly?
I think that would probably be fine as long as I think we should implement this kind of.
By the way, I love that without even a moment, let's just stop. We're in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. We're within walking distance of Dalton. We have just suggested that the premise on which all of this high-priced education is based is just nonsense.
Well, I mean, the evidence. No, but the evidence for that is actually pretty clear.
You're preaching to the choir.
The school outcomes come from their selection of students and those students' others' background factors and things like that, not from the stuff they learn at the school.
The equivalent would be a hospital that boasted of its success in curing people and only admitted the healthiest people.
Right.
So They basically just admitted members of the U.S. Olympic team, and then turned around and said, "Oh my God, look at the health status of our patients.
Right,
It's extraordinary. They're setting world records. That's how much we cured them."
Right. Things like, yeah. No.
Wait. So let's play. So you're in favor of randomization, and what was your caveat?
That I think, especially at those early ages, you just want to make sure anything they do. Like when I first started in training to be a scientist, when I did my first lab work, I thought, here's where I'm going to learn that this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I learned that maybe this wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I wasn't happy about that, but that was a very important signal to get. But I think you want to make sure that you help them maximize their learning from these experiences. And some people do that on their own, so-called self-regulatory learners. And the thing they do the most of is they stop and reflect. Mm-hmm. And so I think you want to help them and make sure that they're getting signal from whatever it is that they're doing. And I don't think you would lose much by randomizing anyway, because the fact is, like when Jim Flynn, who I think we both know, studied college students both in the UK and in the US, he found that the skills that they were able to use to get good grades at elite colleges had I think it was about a 0.03 correlation with their abilities on a test of critical thinking that really matters in the world. Mm-hmm. So we're clearly imbuing people with skills that are no good for critically analyzing the actual world. So I don't think you stand to lose very much in most cases.
What about, this brings up a second notion, which is, does this argument suggest that you may learn more from situations where you are, relatively speaking, performing badly than situations where you're performing well?
Well, so cognitive...
Or is there no relationship?
No, I mean, the cognitive psychologist Nate Cornell would say if your difficulty is not a sign that you aren't learning, but ease is. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. If something is too easy, then maybe you like to do it, but that does mean that you're not learning much, right? Like, you can go to the gym and lift the same weights the same number of times every day, and you won't slide backward, but you also won't cause adaptation.
Yeah.
And so no, I think there is something to that.
So why then do we persist? What is the value of assigning grades to academic performance in high school?
I assume part of the goal is to give people a sense of how they're doing, but if you really wanted to, what self-regulatory learners really need, who are the kind of the best learners, is very fast feedback. So when you actually give them a test and then show them the answers like weeks later, that's not good for learning. You would want to do it like right away, or work with them right away, not just give them the answer. But I think it's because we need a system that like sifts people for colleges, and gives them ostensibly it's to give them some kind of feedback about how they're doing and how their learning is. But I think
But why can't that feedback be private?
I don't know.
I mean, I just started playing with it. It strikes me that the more you think about your argument, the more sort of subversive it becomes. Because if you really wanted to redesign an educational system from scratch based on these ideas, you really are sweeping away a whole lot of the kind of rituals that surround formal education.
I think there are things that are done well in formal education too, I should say. By the way, so chapter 2 is about these steadily rising IQs across the world, and I think some of that has to do with things that are learned in school. In that sense, schools do quite a good job.
That? You think Flynn effect is, so the Flynn effect is this observation that in the developed world at least, and also in parts of the non-developed world, IQs have been rising steadily over the last 100 years? No, 75 years.
Yeah.
I thought that was like, didn't Stephen Johnson famously argue it was video games?
So it seems to be this, well, it's controversial, but it seems to be this more abstract thinking basically, because all the gains have been on the most abstract type of tests, like not the stuff that's taught in school. So that's an argument that school hasn't helped, but it's like things like Raven's progressive matrices where you get these abstract designs and you have to fill in the missing one. So this was supposed to be the test that, like, if Martians landed, it could tell how smart they were. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's the one that has had the most change. And so I don't think it's from things that are explicitly taught in school, but the way that we've learned to, as Flynn would say, look through scientific spectacles to do classification and abstraction. I don't think that's necessarily taught on purpose, but I do think it is ingrained in what happens in school. And I don't want to rag on schools too much, because I point out in the, I point
What's
out...
stopping you?
Well, I mean...
This is the perfect place to rag on school, David. You have...
No. Well, but I do point out that everyone thinks that education has gotten worse since their day, right? But actually, so I put in range some questions from, like the 60s that sixth graders would
Does everyone
face.
say, I thought everyone
and
said
now,
education's got more expensive since their day.
higher education, I think, right? But so this would be like middle school education, basically. And there is, without question, middle schoolers have a better grasp of basic concepts than their forebears did, without question. But if you look at the test questions that test the same level in the 60s, it was like, rate times time problem, just apply it. And now it's like these complex word problems that require multiple steps. And so the challenge has gotten much harder because we're not training people to do repetitive tasks anymore because we're not in that same kind of industrial world. So school is actually doing better. It's just the challenge has outpaced that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. In any case, the main thrust of your argument is not so much that what schools are doing is wrong, but that the techniques that students and parents use to navigate education are wrong. We're making we're just making the wrong choices within a school environment. That's really the kind of...
Yeah, I mean, one program that I learned about while I was researching is called Career Academies that targets kids who, are by traditional measures not really headed to college and gives them some sort of vocational training, basically, or early exposure to types of work. And surprisingly, even when they often do not decide to go in to do anything with that career, they still do better overall, like income-wise, going to do something totally different. And I think a little bit of that has to do, again, they're getting more significant sort of signal about themselves and about match quality than you often do in traditional classes.
Yeah, yeah. When is, speaking of match quality, presumably you can keep searching forever.
I mean, I have no idea what I'm going to do when I grow up. I literally have no idea what I'm going to do now. Like, no idea. I mean, when I was a teenager, I thought I was going to go to the Air Force Academy, be a test pilot, and be an astronaut, and I've gotten like linearly less long-term goal-directed.
I don't know whether your particular position right now as a best-selling author is generalizable to the general public.
No, I mean, but this was, but in the Dark Horse project, in the book, the common trait of people who find fulfillment in their careers is a focus on short-term planning, and that resonated with me so much such that I ended up as a subject in the study, which I disclose in the book. What they do is they all came in and would say, well, don't tell people to do what I did because I came through this weird path where I thought I was going to do one thing and then I tried, I didn't like it, so I zig and zag. And they all view themselves as having come out of nowhere, which is why the researchers called it the Dark Horse Project. Mm-hmm. And their common trait is this short-term planning where they don't look around and say, here's who's younger than me and has more than me. They say, here's who I am right now, here are my skills and interests, here are the opportunities in front of me, I'll try this one, here's my hypothesis about what I'll learn, and a year from now I'll change because I will have learned something new. And they just do that until they get to a spot where they can kind of uniquely succeed and feel fulfilled. And so I've totally abandoned that longer-term planning in favor of these short-term proactive experiments. And why would you have to stop? You can keep doing that your whole life.
If you were running a company based on these observations, would you put that observation into practice? That's to say, right now, companies do a version of this, right? They silo people from the get-go. Mm-hmm. You start out in marketing, you stay in marketing, unless you're one of the very, very few to rise to the very top, and then maybe you get a shot to... Are you saying you would do much more cross-specialization with it, even for people in their 30s and 40s?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my favorite characters in the book kind of got her first real job when she was 54, basically. But and a lot of the characters did that. Oliver Smithies was another of my favorite characters, right? Who he started in med school and then does chemistry and because he sees a lecture and loves it and becomes a biochemist when that was not a thing. Now that's its own specialty. At the time it was this weird hybrid. And then in his 50s he decides to take a sabbatical 2 floors away. Like every couple of years he goes in a new domain, 2 floors away from his own lab to learn DNA, and then at 60 does his work that wins him the Nobel Prize. Or like Andre Geim, in the last chapter, the only scientist who's won both the Ig Nobel Prize for the silliest research and the Nobel Prize for, and he says...
Which one did he win first?
Ig Nobel.
Oh, I see.
For levitating frogs with magnets. And
why is that Ig Nobel? That sounds really interesting to me.
They ask you if you're willing to accept it because of the reputational thing first. And he was happy to accept it. And he likes to say, it's psychologically unsettling to switch gears, but he likes to say, I don't do research, I only do search. And I sort of loved that. And we were just talking about Bill Simmons before this and The Ringer, who's bounced around and had some huge successes and some failures in some of the work that he's done. And one of the things is now these people who are becoming famous at The Ringer went in with totally different jobs. and he allowed them to come on a podcast or to write a story or do this other thing, and now they are famous.
Yeah.
Because he allowed this sort of internal mobility in them to try things. Like you were just calling someone a genius who was hired as an online editor and now is a famous podcaster, right? And that's not what she was hired for. And he allows people to try different things.
Yeah.
It's one of like the happiest workplaces I've visited too.
Well, it's interesting because what that reminds us is that we have, going back to this question of match, we have way too much confidence in the accuracy of the match mechanisms that are in place.
For sure.
Like, so there is no reason for someone who is 25 or 28 or 30 years old to believe the system has successfully matched them with what they ought to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, or you can always be looking to make that match better, right? And again, this is what the Army realized, where they said our traditional tests are not doing as good a job as this talent-based branching, basically, and that you have to actually do some experimentation. And maybe that's annoying, but it should be viewed as an investment in long-term development.
Yeah. Wait, we have questions, and I've been remiss in not looking at them. Here's a good one that points out that there's a difference between the U.S. and the English educational systems, and to our credit, we generalize longer, and the Brits specialize earlier.
Yes.
So they must. Your argument would suggest they're paying a price for that.
Correct. In fact, the economist who studied that got interested in it because he was going to go into the British school system. At the last minute, decided he wasn't sure what he was going to do, and decided to come into the U.S. school system instead. And that got him interested in studying specialization timing. So he looked at, for example, the school systems in England and Scotland, which are very similar except for specialization timing, where Scotland allows some more sampling. In England, mid-teen years, you already have to be like applying to programs in college. And he said, who wins this trade-off, the early or the late specializers? And what he found was it's usually the late specializers that, there's a million ways to get to performance, but that the late specializers have higher growth rates because they match better, and they end up quitting less because they match better.
Do you think that is more of an issue with people of high ability? That is to say, do people of high ability require longer to find their match?
I don't know. I think, I don't know the answer to that. I think you could make the argument that they have more options to choose from. So for example, like if you look at something like the study of mathematically precocious youth, which has these 5 cohorts that it started tracking from age 12. And so some of these people are middle-aged now. It takes these kids who have scored 800 on the SAT when they're 12 on the SAT math, and the girls who score 800 tend to also score like super high on the verbal. If you score high on one, you tend to score high on the other, but a lot of the girls who scored 800 on math score very high on verbal, and they tend to have this wider variety of careers, whereas if some of the boys have this high ability tilt, then they'll go toward that tilt. But the people who are more even tend to have these more options, so they spread across this larger number of careers.
Well, there's a lovely, if I'm remembering this research correctly, they make this lovely observation that boys define what they like as what they're good at, and girls don't. They separate those two traits. And this is why they were trying to understand why there were all these brilliant girls who were brilliant in science and math, who were leaving science and math. And they thought they had scrubbed out all the bias and scrubbed out and they were still puzzled by this. And what they realized in the end was it was this difference in definition. It's a matching definition. Boys matched to things they were good at, thinking that correlated with what they would like. And girls never made that decision. And in many ways, the girl position is superior to the boy position, don't you think?
Typical.
Yeah. Hold on. How does being a generalist protect one against AI?
Yeah, so that's kind of like the topic of the first chapter in some ways. So I think it's, and I didn't make this up, an AI researcher gave me this idea to think about AI on a spectrum from chess, where it's based on, there's a huge database of previous knowledge. There are very constrained rules, it's not changing. And so computers have made totally explosive exponential progress, done. To self-driving cars, where we've made huge progress and very constrained rules, but there are sometimes unfamiliar situations, and it turns out we were not as close, right? Like Elon Musk keeps pushing it out 2 years, every 2 years and 2 years, to when we're gonna have all the way to something like scientific research or cancer research, where IBM's Watson has been such a big flop that some of the AI researchers I talked to were worried that it would damage the reputation of AI in healthcare. And as one of the oncologists I quoted said, the reason Watson did well on Jeopardy and not in cancer research is because we know the answers to Jeopardy. And so I think in those challenges that are more repetitive, those are much more amenable to automation. Or if you look at things like James Beson's work, a good example is the ATM. When that came in, it was supposed to obviate bank tellers. And in fact, it caused more bank tellers because it made every branch cheaper. And so banks could open more branches and they could hire more tellers overall. But it totally changed the job from someone who had these very specific procedural skills that had to do with transactions to someone who has this much more amorphous human behavior, marketing, customer service kind of orientation, to these much more sort of softer skills. And even where AI is really good, like in chess. I mean, it was Garry Kasparov who recognized when he played Deep Blue Moravec's paradox, this idea that humans and computers have opposite strengths and weaknesses. And he realized the computer was far superior at tactics, which is patterns. That's that's most of chess, and grandmasters pattern study is their advantage. But humans are good at strategy, this bigger picture planning of how to manage the little battles to win the war. And so some of his efforts led to this freestyle chess tournament where humans could play with computers or whatever they wanted. And a couple of amateur humans with normal laptops beat the best humans, they beat the best computers, and they beat the best grandmasters with the best computers, these so-called centaur teams. These were people who were moderate amateur chess players who knew something about computer search, who could handle a lot of flowing information. So suddenly, overnight, this stuff that Kasparov has spent his life learning is outsourced to the computer, and he's no longer the best. Where when the humans are doing the thing that humans are uniquely good at.
Yeah. By the way, parenthetically, I've never understood why people got so worked up about the fact that a computer could beat a human in chess. It's like getting worked up about the fact that a car can beat a human in a race.
Well,
it's like, yeah, it's a car. I mean, why we have races because we race people who are like ourselves, right? You don't race a car normally because it's in a different class, has an engine, uses gasoline.
Speak for yourself.
So, and then in chess, they're like they import not just a different species, but an actual a machine, and they're like, whoa, the machine can beat me. Well,
I mean,
it's just crazy.
It was IBM marketing. You know?
It was actually, I think that this was at IBM. We're almost out of time, but we have about a few more minutes. What has been, your book has been out for how many days?
2.
But
I guess if you count today, 3.
You're too modest to say this. It's everywhere and having this kind of sensational effect. And when David and I did a similar kind of thing back in March.
Sports-centric, only sports.
And I have to say, as you were describing this idea to a room full of, it was at this sports nerd conference called Sloan, and there was like 2,000 nerds. And they were so riveted, you could have heard a pin drop as you were explaining this. There is something about this idea that seems to grab people by the lapels. Why do you think everyone is so kind of powerfully attracted to this argument?
I think there have been very strong arguments that people perceive going in the other direction, for one.
Why are you looking at me?
No reason.
Who are you looking at, David? Don't see anyone behind me.
But I think this is a topic, how broad or how specialized to be, that is important to everyone, whether they discuss it explicitly or implicitly. That the signal is very strongly on one side to only do one, and that we talk about all the time, but that we talk about purely with intuition. And so I think my goal was not to be the final word on this, because I don't even know ultimately how you could ever have the final word on this, but to look and see what research was out there and bring to those conversations some concrete information that I hope could make those discussions much more productive and interesting for people. So I hope it's that this important discussion that's only been grounded in intuition maybe will go a little bit of a different place now. And that plus so much of it was deeply counterintuitive for me. Again, this idea that you can do things in the short term that undermine your development in the long term. And so I think, apparently counterintuitiveness sometimes works in writing.
Yes, it does. It does. David, thank you very much. David will be, by the way, before you, don't clap yet. David, you will be signing books where? Downstairs?
I'm not sure.
Somewhere in this area, David will be signing your books. I encourage you all to read this book. I genuinely think it is an eye-opening and much-needed and beautifully written book, and you're to be congratulated.
And you know, I want to thank you for your support of it, because like I said, this has been like a model sort of intellectual relationship for me.
You're making me sound like I'm an old guy, like this is Karate Kid.
No.
And you're...
I take it all back.
Take it all back. All right, thank you very much, David.
Thank you.